Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining me this morning. My name is Beth Weaver, as some of you know, and we're going to be continuing on in the Book of Style today for this webinar. We're going to do a little bit differently here in the sense that I'm just going to show you my screen here. So we are going to be doing some Book of Style, and we're going to be talking about abbreviations, particularly kind of continuing on from the last webinar that we had, that I had, I should say. So we're going to be focusing on Chapter 9. And I'm also going to give you the opportunity this time to allow it to be a little bit interactive in terms of the question and answers and so on, and test your knowledge. We're going to do that just a little bit more, a little bit differently, and we're going to, because I know people have lots of questions about the Book of Style. And particularly abbreviations. So we're just going to kind of carry along and have some fun with this, and hopefully you'll be able to learn a few things in the process. So let me just, I have my chat window open, and at all times, of course, for those of you who haven't been here before, you are certainly welcome to ask questions along the way, and we'll just answer them as we go. Okay, so one of the things, I'm just going to organize myself here. There we go. One of the things that, as I mentioned, I just mentioned, we're going to be in Chapter 9, and this is just the overview again that I've presented before, just to remind people specifically about what abbreviations are and so on. And I think we're all fairly familiar with what it actually is. But just as a reminder too, that abbreviations actually include brief forms, initialisms and acronyms. And of course, these are listed on the screen as you can see here. We I think are all fairly certain and fairly comfortable with the definitions of them, and the acronym, the initialism, and brief form. So that's just a quick review of what we've covered in the previous sessions. So brief forms are usually an initialism. All these three, sorry, are ones that we'll see examples of abbreviations that we're going to deal with today. Okay, so, and again, I put the definition up there, but again, remember, there's an awful lot of question, or what I get as an instructor, what we get a lot is that, you know, how to know when to use one and when not to. Of course, the account specifics will really dictate that for the most part, and so really that's where you need to land. Of course, Book of Style has all kinds of examples and rules on what to use when, but remember, it is to promote clarity in the healthcare record. So if in the event that there is not clarity, then obviously that has to play into it as well. But today we're going to focus on what the Book of Style says, but more specifically how that fits into our account specifics. So let's just jump right in. And as I mentioned here, client preference, meaning account specifics, will always be the final word on the issue. And some of you, and it's worth mentioning, because some of you, I know, well, a lot of us really use the Book of Style as our guide, as we should. But also keep in the back of your mind, as some of you are getting close to the practicum and finishing the course, woohoo! Keep in mind that there will be, surprisingly, there will be some accounts and some companies who actually do not use the Book of Style, believe it or not. You may or may not come across them, but just know that actually is a possibility, that in fact the company you work for may not use the Book of Style. So really what will definitely come into play will be their guide, their rules and regulations on how they want you to type the medical record. So just keep that in mind, that the Book of Style certainly is our gold standard. But even in the course, account specifics do trump the Book of Style, and that may well be the case when you're out in the workplace as well. And so you need to follow the appropriate priorities in terms of where you go to look. Okay, so here's so what I wanted to do is actually remind everybody again. Let's throw some questions out there as we get in. I'm going to start with the dangerous abbreviations, but I want you to throw out questions that you have that have never been answered, or that have come up since the last time that we talked. For example, from the last session that we did. And for those of you who weren't here, that's okay. It's no problem. It is online in the forums, or on the course site. But essentially, we covered everything leading up until, or most of the things leading up to dangerous abbreviations. So if you have questions, this is the time to get them in the chat box so that we can get ahead of the game and I can address them as we go. So I just wanted that to be a reminder for those of you, or for all of you, that is. Put your questions in as we go, and that will add to our day today. Okay, so dangerous abbreviations. This is just such a lovely part of the book of style in terms of how the debate rages on with this kind of stuff. So let's go, if you can go electronically or in your book if you want to follow along, but essentially I'm just going to touch on some things through there, and this is where, again, I invite you to ask questions as you see fit. I'm going to open up my book as well, and you'll see these things on the screen. You can follow along as well. So essentially what has happened is that the Joint Commission, you can read this in your book of style, but essentially there is a minimum list that has been developed by the Joint Commission, and you can read all about the Joint Commission in your book of style. And they have come up with essentially a minimum list of abbreviations, and there's a few different lists, but a minimum list, and that's what you see here on your screen. And so that's also what we use in terms of dangerous abbreviations in the course as well. So as you can see, whether you're looking on the screen or in your book, U as in for unit, IU as in for international units. You see that all the time with vitamin D, for example. QD, or QD as a capital with periods there. The trailing zero, or the lack of leading zero. So we're just going to take some time to just go through this just a little bit quickly. So U as in for unit, as in units for a drug medication, we are to write, as per the Joint Commission and as per Book of Style, we actually write the word unit or units for 1,000 units, 50,000 units, or something like that. And the same applies for international units. Again, you'll see that mostly with vitamin D, for example. So that should be fairly straightforward, I think. Sorry, I'm just noticing that Lisa's saying I'm cutting out. Is anyone else, any of you, can you hear me okay? Lisa, thank you for mentioning that, by the way. Okay. Thank you. Excellent. Thanks, guys, for chiming in there. That's great. Okay. So as I mentioned, the units are fairly straightforward. That's something that I think most of us find fairly straightforward. But again, can anyone think of an exception that, in terms of units specifically now, where it would be okay to use U, as in the capital U? Chime in there on if you've come across exceptions, or if you've read in the Book of Style, for example, what an exception might be for using units. And you can chime in if you know the answer to that. I'll give you the answer. Just remind me. I may not have it on the screen there, but I will put it in a moment. So there are exceptions to that, and we're going to go to there. So again, be thinking about exceptions where you can use units, the capital U. And I see some people are chiming in already. That's good. Yep, Patricia's saying certain types of insulin. That's right, and that actually is very, very important to note, because you will come across that in your transcriptions for sure, and it's an important one. Like I say, to note, that's a gem. And again, I'm going to some of this, I lost some of my PowerPoint today, so you're going to see parts of it. So, but be sure that, or rest assured that when I'm finished here, I'll send you a full one that we covered today. So if you don't see what we're talking about up on the screen, it's just a technical issue. Okay, so yes, getting back to units, you can actually use units, and it does indicate that it is still acceptable to use units, as in a capital U, when referring to certain types of insulin. Good job. So yeah, I see some of you have seen that already. So you can see when the examples that are indicated in the Book of Style there. So when there are, for example, a capital U 100, and I'm going to try to, just give me a second here. I'm going to stop showing my screen just for one moment and go back, and I'm going to include this. So if you're not seeing my screen, don't panic. I'm just pausing to add something here. So the units, yeah, so that's specifically when you're using international units, you can actually, sorry, units for insulin, there are exceptions, and I'm going to put them up on the screen here so that you can see them in case you don't have. And honestly, in terms of these, the ones that are represented in the Book of Style book, I actually haven't come across those particular ones. The U100 and so on. I'm going to put them in just because it's worth 500. Okay. It's worth noting because you'll come across insulin all the time, and it's one of those things that you'll want to note. And I'm going to put it up. Sorry, I'm trying to talk and do something at the same time. That's a never good thing. I just lost it again. Okay, so essentially, I'm not going to go there. There's seriously something going on with my stuff here, so I apologize. There we go. Okay. So yeah, so Patricia's mentioning, and that's what I was just mentioning or trying to type out for you. But the units that are specifically mentioned that are okay to use in terms of insulin are at in your book, and specifically if you're looking for a page, it's 208, as Patricia notes there. So it's not when, for example, it says the patient was given 500 units of insulin, or Toronto is actually an insulin. Or various 500 units of, you wouldn't be able to use the U there in place of units when it's written like that. But when you see the U 100 and directly following, you can use it in that way. So they're very specific examples of when you can use the capital U for unit. So just take note of those because you'll just want to take note. You don't see it very often, but there you go. QD, or capital Q, capital D. This is one, that I get all the time in our in reports, and it seems to trip up people, and I'm not sure why. And let me clarify a couple of things here. You see this QD here, which of course is Latin. It's a Latin term that means once daily or every other day. I have rarely, if ever, seen it used as every other day, but some of you may have, or some of you might moving along as well. But QD, if it's dictated specifically as QD, we are not NOT, not supposed to use QD. In every instance that I can possibly think of. So if QD is dictated, you are to put, or you are to use daily, as in type out the word daily. Now, if anyone can think of, yeah, but what about Q something, Q day, or any other Q hourly, Q weekly. Q day is another one that trips people up because they think that this is actually, that it applies specifically to this area, to this rule. And actually, while that's not totally outrageous, Q period day is actually acceptable to include in your reports if dictated that way. However, you wouldn't put, if someone says, if QD is dictated, you wouldn't put Q daily. I've seen that as well, and that is incorrect. Okay, so if QD is dictated, you will want to include the word daily. If Q day is dictated, that is acceptable. Okay, and it would be Q period day. Okay, with a space in between, by the way. So Q period space day. That is acceptable because it's not QD, and Q day will be read as Q day. So that's just another one of those ones that you'll want to take note of. QD is definitely dangerous. Do not use it, and we are to use daily instead. Q day is acceptable if dictated that way. Okay? Now, trailing zeros is one of those, trailing zeros and the lack of leading zero. These are ones that can trip people up. And maybe what I'll do, I'm going to go to my screen so I can type some examples in again. I apologize. This was, in fact, in this report when I did it, and I lost it. And there it is. So I'm going to actually just stop sharing my screen just for 1 second. And so if you're seeing a blue screen, don't panic. What I'm actually going to do when I'm talking about trailing zeros, and I think some of you know exactly what I'm talking about here, but I'm going to show some examples of what I'm talking about, the trailing zero. So 5.0 centimeter. And I think you'll understand, hopefully anyway. I'm going to put leading zeros here as well. There we go. Okay. Okay, so essentially what we're talking about, the trailing zeros, sorry, there we go. The trailing zeros are the trailing, meaning following. So what the Book of Style actually says, and if we go back, it says the trailing zero were never, what? Never to write a zero by itself after a decimal point. Really? Okay, so that's meaning, so if we have, for example, 50 milligrams of a medication. So 50 milligrams is dictated. That's what they're talking about there. With this trailing zero rule, they're talking specifically about medications here. Okay, so what when there are exceptions, and as you know, that we're gonna talk about those exceptions as well. But the trailing zero rule in 9.3, as you can see there, and you can read about it as well. The rule about omitting trailing zeros pertains only to medications. Okay, now if we're talking about something related to a specimen or mass, as you can see, it's a different story. But when we're talking about medications, we don't include that trailing zero. So we don't include 50.0 milligrams of, of a medication, ibuprofen or something like that. That could be totally wrong. So and the reason for that is that it could get misinterpreted as 500, as you can well imagine. So so for trailing zeros in medications, we are not to write a zero by itself after a decimal point. And so the same thing but different applies to a lack of a leading zero, meaning in the front. So it says always use a zero before a decimal point. And again, we're talking about medications here. Okay, so if you read, you can also read there on 208, the same page as the units, and I'm going to get to questions here in just a second. What we're talking about is specifically as it relates to medications here. Okay, in terms of the trailing zero, and there are other exceptions for the lack of leading zero. So the point is that if you have a medication that's 0.5, it's not going to be 0.05, but it's going to be 0.5 milligrams. If the dictator says 0.5, we have to include that zero, even if it's not dictated, so that it doesn't get misinterpreted, on the other hand, as 5 milligrams. So the lack of a leading zero can be dangerous, or a trailing zero can be dangerous. So what they're telling us is that when we have medications, we don't include a zero at the end after the decimal point if one isn't dictated, because a 50.0 could be misconstrued or misinterpreted as 500. And alternatively, a lack of a leading zero could actually be misinterpreted. For example, 0.5, if we forgot the zero, it could be misinterpreted as 5 if there was just a decimal point there. Okay, so I think that's fairly straightforward. It can get confusing if you spend too much time in your head about that, but if you just take a look at that, and if there's questions, write them down. I'm going to go to a couple of questions here because there are some. Kelly is saying, so if they dictated U100 now we're going back to units again. That is how you transcribe it. But if it was dictated 100 units, you transcribe it as 100 units. That's okay, Kelly. She was apologizing for the late question. Yes, that's essentially it. Now there could be exceptions to that, but that the example that is given in the Book of Cell on 208 is very specific, as I mentioned. They identify the insulin there as units 100. It's very specific. It's a very specific formatting. So if they dictated it that way, then yes, as in U100, then yes, you would transcribe it that way. But as you say, if it was dictated 100 units, then you have to spell out units. That's right. Yeah. So hopefully that's fairly clear. There, Denise is saying a question regarding QD, capital QD. I don't know if that matters with your question, but is it for daily or every other day? How do you differentiate this? Okay, Denise, good question. QD, for example, as I mentioned, is typically QD, whether it's lowercase or uppercase, although you wouldn't see a QD with uppercase probably very much either. But in my experience, I have rarely seen QD to mean every other day. Now, that's a great question, but in my experience, QD has been intended to be daily. If a doctor wants it to be represented as every other day, they would typically, and I'm saying typically, not every time, but typically state it. But again, in my experience, daily has always been the intent. So I think it would be fair to say that if QD is dictated, that you would assume that it's daily unless the dictator has indicated otherwise. Good question. Good question. Lisa's saying medications and question mark because you cut out on me. Oh, medications for the leading zero. Oh, mostly for medications. Sorry, Lisa, the question was the lack of leading zero. There are exceptions for, or when we're talking about medications and something. I was going to say and specimens, but actually that's a different ballgame altogether. So you didn't miss anything, Lisa. The lack of the leading zero here as it relates to this rule, or what it's relating to, is always use a zero before a decimal point when it's referring to medication. But you know, and I'm thinking about that, if it's a lesion or something like that as well, the same would apply. So it's not just in medication for the lack of leading zero, because you can see that it would be if you have, and I'm going to go to the next one here, if you have a measurement, for example, if you have a measurement, say that it's a 0.5 centimeter wound, you wouldn't want to leave out the zero there, because again, it could easily be misinterpreted as a 5 centimeter or 5 millimeter wound. So actually, Lisa, in answer to your questions, there still could be, and I'm thinking of calibers, for example, and so on, that might be an exception. But yeah, generally speaking, using a leading zero is very, very important, because you can see how easily that could get misinterpreted then, as a 0.5 could easily be construed as a 0.5. 0.5 could be misconstrued as a 5. So I'm not going to say that there are no exceptions, but there are fewer exceptions when we're talking about leading. And so you can see here the trailing zero, and again, it goes on to say when, and this happens even in practicum reports, for example, when a specimen or a lesion or something like that, when a pathology reports, when a doctor actually, or a dictator actually dictates a 5.0 centimeter lesion, we are to include that, a 5.0 centimeter or millimeter specimen, a 5.0 whatever incision, that kind of thing. If they include that, they're being intentional, and especially when it comes to pathology and specimens and so on, because a 0.1 or a 0.2 of centimeter can be significant. So why they're including that is to indicate the exact or precise nature of the wound or the lesion or whatever. So the trailing zeros in that case often are important, especially, like I say, when they're talking about an incision or or a wound or something like that. If it's dictated, when it comes to lesions or otherwise, as it indicates in the Book of Style, wound, specimen, lesion, etc., then you are to include it, as it says here. So when an author dictates a trailing zero and any other measurement other than medication to describe a mass, lesion, wound, specimen, organ, etc. And in that case, transcribe as dictated, but the zero would be included only if it's dictated. So do not make assumptions there. If the doctor is dictating some things and you think, oh, wait a minute, this is a specimen, and he says 5 by 4 by 3 centimeter specimen was taken from the, was collected for analysis. Then don't assume and just put a 5.0 times 4.0 times 3.0 if it's not dictated. So bottom line, when it comes to lesions and wounds and this kind of thing, other than medications, you would only transcribe the trailing zero if dictated. Okay? So hopefully that's clear. Any questions on that so far? And if so, just throw them right in there into the chat box. Okay, and so now we're going to go for, I think it's here. Oh, yes, here we go. So now we're continuing on in the dangerous abbreviations again, in terms of the do not use list. And this, don't get too hung up on which list is which. You can read about it in the Book of Style, but we also, as it indicates, it refers to all of these lists. The account specifics refer to all these lists in 9.3. So there's a couple that I just picked out just because they're ones that we see all the time. And again, there are exceptions even in this list, as you can imagine. And I think most of these are fairly familiar to us, for those of us who have been doing it for a while. And I'll get to your question in just one second, Lisa, actually. So Lisa's saying, are there any exceptions where you would never put a leading or trailing zero even if dictated? I'd hesitate. If dictated, thinking. And again, I mentioned caliber, but I'm going to look up the actual caliber. None that come to mind right off the top of my head, Lisa. I'm going to actually look, make sure that's not the case, but I hesitate to say that there are no exceptions. So let me think about that. I can't think of any that come to mind. But yeah, calibers is the first one that came to my mind, and I'm going to actually look that up. If someone wants to look it up real quick while I am also looking something up, you can actually look it up as well. There it is, 238. Okay, let's look it up right now. That's the one that came to my mind. And it says, there we go, it's used to indicate, of course, the diameter of the bullet. And you can see there, in that case, yeah, there's no leading zero there. Do not place a leading zero before the decimal point. So I'm looking at, English is my second language today, 10.3.2. Okay, so 10.3.2 is the caliber, as in the weapon, the caliber of the diameter of the bullet. And in that case, we do not use a leading zero, which is what I had in my head. I just didn't know where the book of the reference was right off the top of my head. So that's in 10.3.2. And why do you think that the leading zero would not be included there? Because there's another formatting question there, really. That's in there. But why do you think that the leading zero would not be included in, I'll try to put it up on the screen here, in a 38 caliber in that formatting? Sorry. Why do you think that? Anybody have any ideas? The hint, well, part of it anyway, is in how it's formatted there. Yep, some of you are saying because bullet sizes have a zero. Yeah, okay. I don't know about that, but because I just don't know the answer. Caliber is the measurement as in millimeters. Good. It also describes the weapon. Lisa doesn't know, or doesn't know what the question is. The hyphen, Kelly's saying, and it can change the size of the caliber. Yeah, essentially what I was getting at there, and I didn't mean to be vague, but maybe I was, is that I'm going to show my screen again. It's just going back, is because it actually, the way that it's formatted there, and again, we're referring to 10.3.2, and it's because it actually includes the word caliber. It's hyphenated, so it's .38 or a 38, as some of you would see in movies for Westerns and so on, a 38 caliber pistol. So that's how it would be dictated. So you'd have to know that you're going to put .38 and your hyphen, because it's a compound modifier, caliber pistol. And the reason why it would be okay there, in my opinion, that we would be leaving out the leading zero is because of the word caliber. The descriptor is in there. And so so it's actually very specific. There's no denying that we're talking about a 38. That really, it's not going to be misconstrued, even if someone said it's a 38 special, like, you know, the song, don't make me sing, don't make me do it, then it's not going to hurt someone. That is, it's understood. So the understanding is that it's a 38 caliber or a 22 caliber, a 22 gauge, things like that. So that's why. So sometimes it's all, well, no, a lot of times it's all about context. So if some of you are wondering, well, why wouldn't a zero be included there? Because the descriptor, because of that caliber, it's fairly clear. There would be very little room for misinterpretation there. Okay? So hopefully that answers your question, Lisa. Good question. Let me go back here. We have a question from Denise, who's saying, I had CC for craniocaudal, it's craniocaudal, in a transcription yesterday, so definitely a dangerous abbreviation. Oh yeah, well, except it wouldn't be a small, two small c's if it were an abbreviation for something else. Remember the definition for abbreviations in terms of initialisms and short forms and acronyms. So if it's representing something, it wouldn't be in small letters. But yeah, good comment, Lisa, in terms of it can be, and we see that often, don't we, in abbreviations where something can represent a few things, like PAP, for example. When some people represent, and I see this all the time, and I actually mention it in grading reports, that people, when pap smear, for example, has been dictated, and we talked a little bit about this last week, when pap smear has been dictated and people use, students use capital P, capital A, capital P smear. Now, because smear is there, we know that it's PAP, as in Papinicolio, but PAP, as in the capital letters, PAP, actually represents something in terms of respiratory, well, and it can represent other things too, but as in positive airway pressure. So it's very important that you understand that the difference even sometimes between a short form and an acronym or initialism, because a pap smear, PAP, would be capital P, small a, small p, because it's a short form or a brief form for Papinicolio. So sometimes you just have to think it through and get those critical thinking neurons firing so that you can get even work it out in your own head on how you're going to actually cope with it. Lisa, Lisa started a whole other thing on gauges. I don't know anything about guns either, but no, if it were 38 gauge, and gauge is misspelled, Lisa. 38 gauge would be 38. If it's a compound modifier, it would be a 38 gauge, as in, because gauge represents something different. Well, the same but different. So it's a different argument, but it would be hyphenated probably, like a 38 gauge gun would be 38 hyphen gauge weapon, or if it's a 38 gauge, then that's a whole other discussion. But good question. You can look all about guns on your own time, but yeah, it wouldn't actually have the period, in my opinion, because again, I don't know anything about guns, but gauge represents something different than caliber. There you go. Guns. Let's not talk about that. Okay. So any questions here? Oh, sorry. We missed a couple here. So, okay. HS, at bedtime or half strength, SC or SC capitals, SQ or SQ for subcutaneous, DC for discharge. We've all seen these. and CC, as we mentioned here, and then the AS, AD, AU are all the Latin capitalizations, Latin for the Latin terms of left, right, and both ears, and so on. Now, HS, people ask about this all the time. As you can see, HS is in there, and it means, it could mean half strength or at bedtime. Again, this is another one of those ones that I have rarely seen it to mean half strength, if ever. So most of the time when HS is written, it's intended to be at bedtime, but certainly you'll know by context, hopefully, or the dictator will indicate it if it means half strength. But I have rarely seen it to indicate half strength. And the rest are fairly straightforward as well. Sometimes you'll see DC as for discontinue as well. So you have to be very careful about context again. And CC, oh, sorry, I want to go back to when you see there's HS, of course, at bedtime, and you'll see as well, if you scroll in your book, go further on in your book, they also mention QHS. Which actually we are, if that's indicated, then we are to use nightly. It's actually they're well not one and the same, I guess, but they're very similar. So HS we write at bedtime. QHS, as you can see later on on page 212, I believe. Yep, 212. We are to use nightly. Just a side note, that's another little book of style gem, little one that's very, very slight. But if you want to be a book of style genius or a book of style guru, these are the kind of things that you can pick up. So HS is at bedtime, QHS is is nightly. So small thing, but it's just, again, context, but make sure that you have this dangerous abbreviation list at your fingertips or flagged in your book if you're using your book at all times, because you'll even forget some of the things that are mentioned. And we're going to move on to now the CC, as some of you, as we've mentioned, and Denise has mentioned even that she got it to mean something else. So generally speaking, CC, we are to write ML, as in for milliliters. And guess what? Yes, of course, there are exceptions to this rule. Big surprise there. We are to write ML, for CC for liquid measures only. Now, this can become tricky sometimes. I'll answer your question in just a second, Kelly. This can become tricky if we're not sure, for example, if it's a liquid measure or not. I'm just going to move forward to my next slide, which is just a summary, I think. For example, oh, you know what? Let's not go there quite yet. There we go. Excuse me. The rule for changing CC to ML only pertains to liquid volume. That sounds to be fairly straightforward because, of course, most of the time it's used in terms of medication. However, it is acceptable to use CC when referring to mass to measure organs, tissues, and specimens of solid volume. Also acceptable for use with non-liquid volumes such as gas. Well, okay, this exception can be kind of tricky, but really, if you were unsure, that's true. You'd always flag for sure, or do your research. But generally speaking, this is going to be fairly clear. So liquid volumes, when we're talking about medications and so on, if CC is dictated, then you know that for the most part, mLs or milliliters is what is to be used, because it's fairly certain that they're talking about IVs typically and a liquid volume that's being given to the patient. Fairly straightforward. So we aren't to use CC, we are to use ML. Where you can get tripped up is when they start referring to CCs to measure organs, tissues, and specimens of solid volume and this gas business. So you can see here, and this is a test your knowledge, except I've given you the answers. Sorry. Again, this was an issue with my PowerPoint. So, dictated, ultrasound revealed a 25 cc prostate. What should be transcribed, believe it or not, is a 25 cc prostate. Why? Because it's referring to a solid mass. It's referring to a specimen that's a solid mass. It's not liquid, we know that, and it's not a gas. We know that. That's fairly straightforward. So in this case, 25 cc would be acceptable. Okay? And the same, you look underneath, we're talking about respiratory issue or respiratory related to respiratory. There was a 150 cc difference on spirometry from last measurement. Why is that cc, do you think? Well, because as we know, it's easy to know because it's in front of us, and I'm making it in the I'm making this example in the context of a gas. You'll often see this in spirometry or in respiratory. If you're unsure, of course, you could always flag it. And if you were to put ml, it wouldn't, again, this is not going to be something that you're going to, patient safety would not be in jeopardy, certainly, because they're really used interchangeably. But if we want to be very specific and precise about this, we use ml to represent cc's when we're talking about liquid volumes, but not when we're talking about solid mass or a gas. So again, we don't all have to be scientists here. We just have to use some critical thinking and apply the rules. If you're unsure, certainly you could flag it. But if you're unsure and CC is dictated, you could certainly use CC because that's what's dictated, and you could flag it. So at least the representation is there of what was dictated. So I'm sure we're going to have questions on this. Sorry, get back to your question, Kelly. QH, your first, the first. Your first example, so it's, except you're missing a period. QHS is QH period S period, but you're not going to be using it anyway because you will never type that because it's supposed to be, it's a dangerous abbreviation and you do not want to type it. So if you're actually typing it to represent a dangerous abbreviation, there's no space between them and it's Q period H period S period. Lisa is saying, what about measurements for liquid gases? Are they ml or cc? Oh, I think I just answered that. Because liquid for gases, for example, or if there's an issue, then I would say again, a gas can't be a liquid. I don't think, Lisa. Not to get all sciencey on you, but really, if a gas is a gas, that's why it's a gas. Okay, but then we're talking about, we're getting into something very, very specific, and my guess would probably be that you'd still use CC there. But again, you could flag it, type what's dictated, and flag it. Do some research on that, and then then use your research skills and critical thinking to move forward on that. So we're not going to go into every single gas here, but you can just use, generally speaking, what the Book of Styles says is that it actually is used, CC is acceptable for solid mass and for gases. So generally speaking, like I say, where you run into trouble is when it's in we want to make sure that you use it for liquid volumes. So that is to say we use ml to represent cc's when we're talking about liquid volumes. Kelly is saying, I have not come across any cc referring to mass in the dictations yet, so this is good to know. Yep, and I think there are certainly some in there as well. Patricia, sorry, you're saying never mind, found it. Oh, there we are. Where in the Book of Styles is the rule for liquid versus gas or masses? It's right where we are right now. It's 9.3. It's right in there, but it's actually on page 209, 210. At the top of 209, really. Yeah. Excuse me. And I guess CC is an answer to your, because it actually says it says non-liquid volume, such as gas. So again, if there's a question or concern, you would flag it. You could type what's dictated, but certainly flag it if you're unsure. Okay. Okay. Let me see. What do we have here? This would be certainly time for questions. We've talked about that a little bit. By all means, are we clear about that? Have I confused you more in terms of the dangerous abbreviations? We have a few more minutes. We have about 15 more minutes, which is awesome. We're going to try to move forward. And this is where I think my PowerPoint actually completely quit on me. So we're going to continue on. And I'm just going to see what I do have next here. So if you see my screen disappear, don't worry. Don't panic. Okay, so I'm just going to leave it at questions for now. Whoops. There we go. Okay, so let's move on to what's next, the acceptable forms and symbols. If we don't have any more questions about what's in that, and we might actually, I wanted to bring up a couple, but if we, any questions on the other dangerous abbreviations that are listed there. Per os, for example, is actually listed. The words per os is listed, sorry, on the dangerous abbreviations. You'll see QHS and the Q6PM units, not Q6PM units, Q6PM and units are also there. So just take a look, and I think it's fairly clear there what is listed, although the per os one is worth mentioning just a little bit, because it actually says that per os, if it's dictated as per os, the os can be mistaken for left eye, which is interesting because OS is the abbreviation for left eye. So that's interesting. It actually says use PO by mouth or orally. So that's interesting that that's there. I wanted to bring that up just because some of you may not have seen that. Okay, so moving on into the acceptable forms and symbols. Really, this is also fairly straightforward, and I apologize again for not having the rest of my PowerPoint. It evaporated right before we got on to when we went live. But some of the interesting abbreviations and short forms, now we're talking about 9.4.1 to be very specific. They're talking about AM and PM and so on, and really the bottom line, what it's saying there is that the Book of Style prefers the lowercase a and m for antimeridiem, or in terms of AM and PM, but that both are acceptable. Now, in terms of representing them, they would be in lowercase format with periods, and if you're choosing to use uppercase format, then you do not use periods. And I think that is fairly straightforward, just because of the logic that is explained in the earlier on in the course, or earlier on in the chapter, I should say. So if you are using AM lowercase, then make sure that you represent it as A period M period, or P period M period as your abbreviation. Still, the lowercase forms being preferred. Okay, but it wouldn't be an error. So moving right along, and of course another one that I found interesting, or that we find all the time, and I just want to mention, is BP in terms of blood pressure. Now, what do you think, or do you think that BP, if dictated, and most of you will know the answer to this, especially if you've been in the course for a while, BP, if dictated, say in the physical exam, which is where you're going to find it most of the time, if dictated as BP 120/80 in the physical exam, should you expand it, or should you leave it, or could you leave it as BP? So in the physical exam section, BP 120/80 is dictated. Yeah, some of you are just weighing in all acceptables. Some are saying BP as dictated, leave it, can leave as is, leave as dictated, leave it. Good. Yes, that's exactly right. BP is acceptable as BP if dictated in the physical exam section, for sure. Now, what about, do you think, if it was dictated elsewhere? Like, say, in the diagnosis section. It wouldn't be in the diagnosis section. It would be in the impression. Say it would be in the impression section. Yeah, that's right. Sorry, people are saying spell out expand, expand, expand. Yeah, that's true. That's true. Good. You guys are geniuses. You don't need me. Okay, so let's move right along, and I know that we're running out of time as well, but that's okay. Okay, geniuses, I'm going to try to trip you up. Carrying on, I think it is fairly straightforward what's left there in terms of the Latin abbreviations and so on. Although, are there any questions? Because the Latin abbreviations, especially the Q 4 hours, and I think someone mentioned it earlier, when a doctor dictates Q 4 hours, Q4H, for example. Maybe I'm going to try to come up with my screen. I'm going to drop my screen here just for a second, so you're going to see it, I don't know, some blue screen of death or something, not my lovely gems, so to speak. I'm going to type up some stuff. But what, any questions about Latin abbreviations? It is actually in the abbreviations chapter, but it's right after the dangerous abbreviations, and it could be maybe misconstrued. But any questions about Latin abbreviations? For example, I'm going to put someone else was asking about QHS. I'm going to include that too. Oops. Okay, so I'm going to show you my screen here, and I just typed out a couple of these things so that you can see them. Okay, sorry, I'm going to look at some questions here. Patricia's saying, why is BP expanded even though it is not a disease unless it is high or low? Well, whether it's high or low is irrelevant, really. But BP is expanded because it's not a lab value. It could be argued that it's a diagnostic tool for sure, but really when we're talking about the in the assessment section, the point being why things are expanded and so on in the assessment diagnosis section is that you want to make sure that you're as clear as you possibly can. When you're dealing with a patient and you're talking about what the plan is, what the assessment is, what their diagnosis is, you want there to be no question about that diagnosis, about the content in it. So Patricia, you're asking why BP should be expanded because it's not it's not necessarily, it wouldn't be a lab value like BUN, for example, or MRI. BP is one of those ones that's widely understood to be blood pressure. So you could argue it both ways, but honestly, I would err on the side of expansion there for sure for BP because of the nature of because it's in the assessment. Yeah. And you can back that up with your account specifics as well. Yeah. Because it's not specifically a unit of measures per se, and it's not a laboratory test per se. So I would spell it out. Yeah. Judy is saying Q4 has become commonplace, hasn't it? Well, and that's why I put this on the screen here, the representations that you're going to see, and it talks about the spacing and so on on page 217 for those of you who have your books, or if you're going, this is all listed under 9.4.1 in the Book of Style. You have to go down probably about the middle of the page. So yeah, you'll hear both of these. Again, I put QHS there just to represent, oh sorry, you know what, it's supposed to be QHS, sorry, look at that, I made a mistake even in my own. Okay, there we go. So it should be, if you see, this is how it's actually represented, but it shouldn't be typed that way anyway. It should be nightly. But yes, these, you'll hear Q4H, Q4 hours, Q4 weeks, Q4 months, and so on. Now, all of those are acceptable. They're okay. Just make sure that in terms of formatting that you represent them there possibly as well. And see, that actually doesn't look like it, but there we go. Yeah. And as you can see, they address that very spacing issue in the Book of Style as well. They say we have inserted a space after the numeral 4 in Q4H on the advice of the ISMP, the people who about the abbreviations, so that the number is more easily and clearly read. Invalid Latin abbreviations such as QAM and mixed Latin and English abbreviations such as Q4 hours, every 4 hours, etc., have become commonplace. So there was a time when QAM or those kind of, these were not acceptable because you're kind of mixing up the two, as it mentions, Latin and English, but now they really are commonplace. So just make sure that you type what's dictated, and if Q4 hours is dictated, then put Q4 hours. If Q4H is dictated, then put Q4H. Don't put one, don't put Q4H if Q4 hours was dictated, for example, okay? I see that a lot. I see that a lot. And that's something that it's a minor thing, but if you have to make sure that you type, if Q4 hours is dictated, then make sure you put that. If Q4H is dictated, then you put that. Okay? Did I miss some questions? Lisa's saying, I found that the SI prefix is to be a bit of a challenge, specifically micro or the backwards U. Yeah, no, I hear you, Lisa, on that. And generally speaking, there's been all kinds of debate about that, micrograms, micro, very micro, and so on. And really, what the bottom line in many respects when it comes to micro is to actually spell it out. Again, it's arguable on either side, and we're going to run out of time on that particular one. But yeah, no, that is a challenge. The micro one is a challenge, even though in the actual text it says that you can actually write microgram if that's what's dictated in terms of 75 micrograms for Synthroid, for example. Certainly, microgram MCG is acceptable there for the medication. Where it gets a little trickier is micrograms per liter and so on. And again, that's a whole other, I think I could do a webinar just on that. And you know what, I will make note of that because we're going to run out of time very shortly here. So thanks for bringing that up. That's a great question as well. And Judy's saying that's where you got messed up many times. Yeah, just try to keep it when it comes in micrograms. Let's try to just tie it up in the way that if you're talking micrograms, Synthroid. That's classic thyroid medication. Micrograms are measured in micrograms all the time, and micrograms MCG is perfectly fine, So let there be no mistake about that. Where it gets into a bit trickier is micrograms per liter or micromoles, for example. I think is micromoles per liter. You can actually type out micromoles virgule liter, like capital L for liter, and that's acceptable. Yeah. But and again, I'm going to have a webinar just on that because we're going to run out of time. Maybe what I'll do if there's extra time after we finish here, maybe I'll add it as a little addendum to my PowerPoint and make some notes on it so I can send it out to anybody who wants it when the time comes, or because it's at the moment my PowerPoint is in pieces, but I'm happy to send it out to anybody who wants it as well. But great question. Micromoles is one of those ones that, or micrograms is easier. Micromoles is the one that trips up a lot of people. But when in doubt, certainly you wouldn't be wrong by spelling it out. Let's put it that way when it comes to micromoles. Okay. Kelly's saying, I finally bought my hard copy of the Book of Style. Yay! I wish I had bought it months ago. I find hard copies easier to look through. Yeah, for sure. And you can bring them to the beach. You can, sorry, not bring them. You can, bring them to the beach or, out for dinner. You could, have a date with it. Maybe have a coffee. I know. See? Right. Good job, Kelly. Patricia's saying, Q space 4 period H. Except there's a space there, Patricia. Just be careful. There's a space between the 4 period. There's no period after the 4. Be very, very careful. There's a period after the H. Are not all abbreviations except metric spelled out? No, and that's what we had just talked about, right? Q4H is acceptable as dictated. These days. There was a time when it wasn't, but that's acceptable. Where the one that's really the dangerous one is the QHS, QD. Those are the ones that are dangerous and you're not allowed to use. Okay. Yeah. Because they can be misconstrued for other things. So that's why I mentioned it, because Q4H and these ones that are on the screen as you see now are actually now acceptable. Because of what's included in them. And the reason why QD isn't is because, as you can see, you can read in the text that it could be misconstrued as OD, for example, as in for the eye or something like that. You don't want it to be mistaken for an eye or anything else, OT. Okay. Excellent. Okay, so let me just check the time here. Okay, so we really are out of time. One last question maybe we would be able to answer. And I'm just going to go to my handy screen. I'm sorry, I'm all over the place with my PowerPoint today. Apologize, but it's I don't know, just wasn't intended to be. I've included my personal email just to send questions or comments or suggestions for webinars as well, future. So please, by all means, you can send me that. And if you want a copy of the actual PowerPoint when it's ready to go, you could send me a note to ask for that as well. Or it will be up in a week or so with the actual audio to this session, which will be available as soon as I finish here. I'll put it up as well. But the PowerPoint won't be in its entirety until I get it back together. So thanks everybody for joining me today. We have lots more to cover in Book of Style, and I just might continue with the book of style, just because it's something that I love, and I'm a nerd that way. And so come along with my nerdy ride, or come along on the nerdy ride, I should say. So by all means, send me your comments, questions. Negative feedback is always helpful too, and I welcome that on how we can make this better. So with that, I will leave you all to your typing, and have a great week and good studying, and hopefully we'll talk to you real soon. Thanks everybody. Bye.